But fate at times weaves unexpected plots. On the balcony of the floor below, a majestic albino tiger with piercing blue eyes raised its head. It was not a monster, but a primal force of nature, and something in the vulnerability of that fall awakened an ancestral instinct. At the exact moment the elderly woman approached the surface of the pool below, the tiger, with a silent roar of pure power, leapt. Its massive body plunged into the water with the force of a meteor, creating a colossal wave that rose like a liquid shield. The elderly woman, instead of colliding with the hard surface, was gently cushioned by the crest of the wave. Her fall softened, her life saved by an improbable guardian. Hatred for human cruelty mingled with relief and admiration for the beast that unknowingly had become a protective angel. The cold water enveloped her, a thermal shock that tore through the veil of unconsciousness. It wasn't the crushing impact that her mind, for a thousandth of a second, had anticipated. It was a glacial, yet strangely soft embrace, pulling her down before propelling her back to the surface. Her lungs, which had constricted in a silent scream during the fall, now yearned for air, and she gasped it in desperate gulps, coughing and choking, her vision blurred by the salty water and terror. Still dazed, the elderly woman, whose name was Ilara, tried to orient herself. The world spun. The blue of the sky mingled with the blue of the pool, and the green foliage of neighboring balconies danced in her peripheral vision. But there was something more. A massive white mass, a monumental presence, emerged from the water a few feet from her. The albino tiger, the same one that in an act of pure improbability had become her savior, now floated, majestic and serene, its front paws resting on the edge of the pool, its blue eyes fixed on something beyond her, perhaps on the void of the balcony from which she had fallen. The terror, which for an instant had been replaced by the shock of the cushioned fall, returned with redoubled force. She was in the water, vulnerable next to a wild predator. Ilara's mind, despite her age and trauma, was sharp. She knew the beast had not acted out of benevolence, but out of instinct. A leap into the pool to cool off, perhaps, or to hunt a reflection. The fact that it coincided with her fall was a cruel irony of fate, or perhaps a miracle in disguise. But now, the miracle was transforming into an imminent threat. Every movement of the tiger was calculated. Every muscle under its white fur rippled with contained power. Ilara smelled the damp scent of the beast, its heavy breathing echoing in the morning stillness. The pool, once an oasis of luxury, had become a trap. Above, the balcony of her apartment remained silent, an abyss from which death had lurked. Who pushed her? The question burned in her mind, but it was muffled by the primal instinct of survival. She tried to move her arms, her legs, but her body felt heavy, sore. A sharp pang in her right shoulder made her wince. The fall, even cushioned, had taken its toll. The icy water numbed her limbs, making swimming difficult. The tiger, for its part, seemed oblivious to her presence, or perhaps simply ignored her. Its blue eyes, once piercing, now seemed distant, almost melancholic, but the tiger's calm was deceptive. Ilara knew that a predator, even sated, was always a predator, and she was in its domain, in the water, where the beast had the advantage. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the bubbling of water in her ears and the sound of her own ragged breathing. She needed to get out of the pool, needed to get away from that magnificent and dangerous animal. But how? The edge of the pool seemed unattainable. Every attempt to propel herself resulted in pain and an awkward movement. The fear of attracting the tiger's attention with a sudden movement was paralyzing. She felt like a leaf adrift at the mercy of the currents, and one of those currents was the massive and unpredictable presence of the feline. Suddenly, a sound, not the tiger's roar, but something from above. A metallic creak, almost imperceptible, like a glass door opening or closing. Ilara raised her eyes, her head heavy, and saw a fleeting shadow on the balcony of her floor. A dark silhouette, quick, that retreated into the apartment. The person who pushed her. They were there, watching, or perhaps fleeing. Panic mingled with anger. She was alive, yes, but trapped between an invisible killer and a wild guardian. The tiger, as if sensing the change in the atmosphere, slowly turned its head, its blue eyes now fixed on Ilara. There was no aggression, but a deep, almost ancestral curiosity. A shiver ran down the elderly woman's spine. She didn't know what was more terrifying, the human threat that had hidden, or the beast that, with a simple movement, could decide her fate. The water began to grow colder, Ilara's body trembling uncontrollably. Exhaustion set in, and the pain in her shoulder intensified. She couldn't stay there. But where to go? The edge of the pool seemed too far, and the tiger's presence, now more attentive, prevented her from making any sudden movements. Time was running out, and with each passing second, the life the tiger had inadvertently saved seemed more precarious. Time, which had seemed to stop at the moment of the fall, now raced cruelly, measured not by seconds, but by accelerated heartbeats and desperate gasps of air. The tiger's blue eyes, once distant, now fixed on Ilara with an intensity that chilled her blood more than the cold pool water. There was no anger, no apparent hunger, just a feline curiosity, deep and inscrutable, which was, in a way, even more terrifying. It was the calm of the predator that precedes action, the stillness of an indomitable force, pondering its next move. Ilara felt the weight of the beast's gaze, an invisible pressure that held her in place. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to move, to swim, to flee. But her body, betrayed by the sharp pain in her shoulder and growing exhaustion, refused to obey. Her muscles were stiff, her limbs heavy, and the water, which should have been a means of escape, now seemed a glacial and paralyzing embrace. She tried once more to propel herself, but the pain in her right shoulder reverberated throughout her body, eliciting a muffled groan that was lost in the bubbling water. The movement was clumsy, almost a spasm, and the tiger, as if noticing the slightest alteration, tilted its head slightly, its blue eyes following every millimeter of her futile effort. Above, the balcony of her apartment remained silent, but the fleeting shadow Ilara had glimpsed was an open wound in her mind. The killer. They were there, or had been. The idea that someone was watching her, waiting perhaps for her to succumb to the water or the beast, was a poison spreading through her veins. She was trapped between two mortal dangers, the invisible and calculating human threat and the primal, unpredictable force of the animal. Which fate was less cruel? To be torn apart by claws and teeth, or to be dragged back into the hands of her tormentor? The choice was not hers. Ilara's mind, despite the confusion and dread, began to formulate a desperate plan. She needed to get out of the water. She needed to find a foothold, anything to pull her out of that liquid domain where the tiger reigned. The pool edge, smooth and unattainable, seemed like a mountain, but there was a ladder in the opposite corner, about 30 feet away, a distance that in her condition seemed insurmountable, and the tiger was between her and the ladder, or at least dangerously close. With ragged breaths, Ilara began to move her legs, one weak kick after another, trying to create a minimum of propulsion. Her left arm, though sore, still worked, and she used it to paddle gently, avoiding any sudden movement that might alert the tiger to an escape. It was an agonizing effort. Every inch gained cost an explosion of pain and a gasp of air. The icy water seemed to drain the warmth and strength from her body, and exhaustion became a heavy cloak, threatening to pull her into the depths of unconsciousness. The tiger, however, did not move. Its blue eyes remained fixed on her, but its posture was one of strange passivity. It floated, its front paws still resting on the edge, its white fur gleaming under the morning sun. A surreal contrast to the darkness that enveloped Ilara's soul. Was it a sated predator, or merely a curious observer? The ambiguity was torturous. She could not afford to interpret the beast's calm as safety. A tiger was a tiger, and she was prey. Suddenly a new sound. More distinct this time, the creak of a door, followed by a low murmur, almost inaudible coming from above. Not from her apartment balcony, but from a neighboring balcony, perhaps a floor below. A human voice. Ilara's heart leapt. Help? Or more danger? She couldn't scream, couldn't draw attention to herself without risking the tiger's wrath or the renewed attention of her assailant. The tiger, as if also having perceived the sound, turned its head slightly upwards, its blue eyes now sweeping the adjacent balconies. For a brief instant, the beast's attention diverted from Ilara. It was the chance she needed. With a new surge of adrenaline, the elderly woman propelled herself with more force, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder. Every stroke was an act of pure will, every kick a silent prayer. She moved towards the nearest edge, not the ladder, which was still too far, but to any point where she could grab on. The edge was only a few feet away. Adrenaline pulsed, but her strength rapidly diminished. Ilara's wrinkled and trembling fingers tried to reach out, but the distance was deceptive. She was almost there, but her body seemed to refuse to cooperate. The cold water pulled her down, and the pain in her shoulder was a constant scream. The tiger, still with its head raised, seemed oblivious to her desperate struggle, its blue eyes fixed on something Ilara could not see. But then, a movement, not from the tiger, but from above. A small figure, a child's outline, appeared on the balcony below, the same one from which the murmur had come. A child. Ilara's eyes widened. The child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, was looking down at the pool with an expression of pure curiosity and amazement. And then the child's gaze fell upon the tiger and upon Ilara. The silence was broken by a sharp scream, a cry of childish dread and excitement that echoed through the balconies. The child had seen the tiger, and by extension had seen Ilara. The game of hide-and-seek was over. The world's attention and all the dangers it contained was now turned to the pool, and to the elderly woman adrift next to her improbable guardian. The child's sharp scream tore through the morning stillness, a keen blade piercing the veil of dread that enveloped Ilara. It wasn't a scream of pure fear, but a wild mix of astonishment and fascination, the instinctive reaction of a child's mind to the impossible. An albino tiger in a pool and an elderly woman adrift beside it. The sound reverberated through the glass and concrete walls, echoing in her mind already clouded by exhaustion and pain. It was the end of silence, the end of precarious invisibility. The tiger, at the edge of the pool, reacted with majestic slowness. Its blue eyes, previously fixed on the invisible point above, now turned to the balcony from which the sound had erupted. Its large, powerful head rotated, its white whiskers trembling slightly, like antennae picking up new vibrations in the air. There was no aggression in its gaze, only a feline curiosity, almost bored, which was, in some ways, even more terrifying. It was the center of a spectacle Ilara had not asked for, and now the world was about to discover it. For Ilara, the child's scream was a catalyst for panic. Her muscles, already stiff from the cold and pain, contracted in a spasm. The adrenaline, which for a brief moment had propelled her, now mingled with the terror of being discovered. Not just by the neighbor who now knew of the tiger's presence, but more crucially, by the killer who had pushed her. The shadow on her apartment balcony, the fleeting silhouette, returned to haunt her. Was the assailant listening? Was he watching, waiting for the tiger to finish the job or for her to succumb to hypothermia? The pain in her right shoulder was an incandescent needle, every movement a torment. Her left arm, though still functional, was exhausted. The icy water seemed to drain the last drop of energy from her body. She needed to get out of there, needed to hide, but where? The pool, once an improbable refuge, was now a showcase for her despair. The tiger, in turn, seemed to have lost interest in the child. Its blue eyes returned to Ilara, and it let out a low snort, almost a grunt, that made the water vibrate. It wasn't a roar, but a guttural sound that seemed to measure the distance between them, the fragility of the elderly woman. Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine, a primitive premonition that the truce, if there was one, was about to end. Suddenly, the balcony below stirred. An adult figure, a woman with disheveled hair and a face pale with sleep and shock, emerged hastily, pulling the child back. The woman's eyes widened at the sight. The tiger, the elderly woman, the agitated water. A muffled scream escaped her lips, a sound of pure horror and disbelief. She tried to speak, but the words seemed caught in her throat. Ilara saw the terror in the woman's eyes, a terror that mirrored her own. The woman, with the child in her arms, retreated into the apartment, the glass door slamming shut with a dull thud. But it was too late. The alarm had been sounded. Other glass doors began to open on neighboring balconies, curious and frightened faces emerging. Drawn by the child's scream and the commotion, murmurs began to spread like an uncontrollable fire from balcony to balcony. Time, which had seemed to stand still, now accelerated at a dizzying pace. Ilara knew that the police, firefighters, perhaps even animal control teams would be on their way. But how much time did she have? And, more importantly, how much time did the killer have before being discovered, or before trying to finish what they started? With a strength she didn't know she still possessed, Ilara made a final effort. Her left arm paddled with desperate determination. Her legs kicked the water with renewed impetus, ignoring the searing pain. She dragged herself the last few inches to the edge of the pool, her wrinkled and trembling fingers searching for a grip. The smooth, cold surface of the marble seemed to slip beneath her skin. Then, with a groan of effort, her fingers clamped onto the edge. She tried to pull herself up, but her body was heavy, numb. Her right shoulder protested with excruciating pain, and she felt a sharp pang as if something had dislocated. A cry of pain escaped her lips, mingling with the bubbling water. The tiger, which until then seemed distracted by the commotion on the balconies, turned its head sharply, its blue eyes fixed on Ilara, and, for the first time, there was a flicker of something more than curiosity, attention, an alert. It moved, its front paws sliding from the edge into the water, its massive body sinking a little deeper. The water churned around it, creating small waves that rocked Ilara. She was half out of the water, her arms outstretched, her chest resting on the edge, but her legs still submerged. It was a precarious position of maximum vulnerability. The tiger was a few feet away, its presence imposing and unpredictable. The sound of sirens, still distant, began to pierce the morning air, a promise of help that seemed to arrive too late. Ilara looked at the tiger, her eyes watering with pain and despair. The beast watched her with an intensity that chilled her blood. What would it do now? Would it be her savior again, or her final executioner? Time was running out, and with each passing second, the life the tiger had inadvertently saved seemed more precarious, more at the mercy of an uncertain fate, trapped between the claws of a wild predator and the shadow of a human killer. The tiger, with its glacial blue eyes, fixed on Ilara with an intensity that made her already chilled heart leap. It was no longer passive curiosity, nor the momentary distraction with the child's cry. It was something more primitive, more focused. A glint of recognition or assessment, The low snort it let out was not a roar, but a sound that seemed to vibrate through the water, hitting Ilara in the chest like a deep note from a giant instrument. Its front paws, previously just sliding, now moved with more purpose. The tiger's massive body sank a little deeper, and it began to swim slowly towards her, its powerful white shoulder blades flexing under its wet fur. Ilara, her fingers desperately clinging to the marble edge, felt paralyzing terror. She was trapped, half in, half out, an easy prey. Her right shoulder throbbed with excruciating pain, now radiating through her neck and arm, making any significant movement impossible. Her left arm, though still functional, was at the limit of exhaustion, its muscles trembling uncontrollably. The icy water, which had previously seemed a blessing for cushioning her fall, was now a torment, draining the warmth and strength from her already weakened body. She tried to pull herself up, but the marble was slippery, and the weight of her body seemed insurmountable. Each attempt was a muffled groan, a silent struggle against gravity and weakness. As the tiger approached, the chaos on the neighboring balconies intensified. Murmurs turned into shouts, glass doors slammed, and the sight of shocked and terrified faces multiplied. Ilara could hear fragments of conversations, words like tiger, pool, an old lady. Panic was contagious, and she could feel the shockwaves spreading through the building. The sirens, previously distant, now wailed with increasing urgency. The sound cutting through the morning air like a promise of help, but also as a warning to the killer. Was he listening? Was he watching, perhaps with a cruel smile, the agony of his victim, the spectacle he had orchestrated? The idea that he might still be there, invisible watching, was almost as terrifying as the tiger's presence. The tiger was now just a meter from Ilara. Its blue eyes, once distant, now reflected her own distorted image in the water, an old and broken figure. It didn't seem aggressive, but its proximity was overwhelming. It let out another snort, louder this time, and the water around Ilara churned. She could feel the animal's warm breath, the smell of dampness and something wild, untamed. It didn't roar, it didn't attack, but its presence was a constant threat, a reminder that at any moment nature could claim its price. Suddenly, a new sound, closer, more strident. It wasn't a siren, but a human voice, amplified by a megaphone. "Attention! Remain inside your apartments. Do not approach the balconies." The voice was authoritative, but there was a note of poorly disguised panic. It was the police, or perhaps the firefighters arriving. Ilara felt a brief flash of hope, quickly replaced by new terror. How would they deal with a tiger? Would they shoot it? And what if the tiger, in a panic, attacked her? The tiger, in turn, seemed to react to the sound of the megaphone. Its ears twitched, picking up the vibrations. It stopped swimming, floating motionless, but its blue eyes remained fixed on Ilara, as if she were the only anchor point amidst the growing chaos. There was a strange duality in its behavior, the inherent ferocity of a predator, mixed with an almost protective passivity. It was an enigma, an improbable guardian, or a patient executioner. Ilara knew she didn't have much time. Exhaustion was a heavy veil over her mind, and the cold was seeping into her bones. Her lips were blue, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. She needed to get out of the water, needed medical help. But with each attempt to pull herself up, the pain in her right shoulder was an explosion of agony, and her left arm failed, slipping on the damp marble. She was on the verge of unconsciousness, her vision blurred, sounds distant. A new movement, not from the tiger, but from above. A thick rope, with a hook at the end, descended from one of the upper balconies, swinging precariously. Then a male voice, closer, but still distant. "Madam, try to grab the rope. We're coming down." It was a rescue, but a dangerous one. The rope swung just out of her reach, and the tiger was there, between her and any chance of safety. The tiger, as if perceiving the new threat or the new opportunity, let out a low growl, a sound that made Ilara tremble. It didn't move towards the rope, but its blue eyes narrowed, fixed in the direction from which the rope came. It was a warning growl of possession. Was it protecting its territory or its prey? The ambiguity was overwhelming. Ilara looked at the rope, then at the tiger. The distance was small, but the effort to reach it seemed monumental. Her wrinkled and trembling fingers could barely maintain their grip on the edge. With each second, her strength abandoned her. The image of the killer, the shadow that had pushed her, flashed in her mind. He was still there somewhere, watching, and now, with the arrival of help, he might feel cornered, desperate to finish the job. The tiger suddenly made a decisive move, not towards Ilara, but towards the edge of the pool, near where she was. It placed its front paws on the marble again, but this time more firmly, as if preparing to get out. Its massive body rose slightly, muscles tensed. Was it getting out of the water, or was it positioning itself for an attack? Ilara felt a last surge of panic. If the tiger got out of the pool, she would be even more exposed, even more vulnerable. The rope swung inches from her fingers. With a muffled cry of pure frustration and despair, she gathered what remained of her strength. Her right shoulder protested, but she ignored the pain. She stretched out her left arm, fingers trembling, trying to grasp the swinging rope. The tip of the rope brushed her fingers, slippery. Almost there. The tiger, with a powerful snort, began to pull itself out of the pool, its claws scraping on the marble. The sound was deafening, and the water churned violently. Ilara, with a final effort, managed to grab the rope, but the tiger's movement unbalanced her. She slipped from the edge, falling back into the icy water, the rope still clutched in her fingers, but pulling her down with the weight of her own body. The tiger was now almost completely out of the water, its imposing silhouette against the morning sky, and Ilara was again submerged, the rope in her hands, but exhaustion pulling her into the depths. Rescue had arrived, but the danger was far from over. The tiger, the killer, exhaustion, everything mingled in a whirlwind of terror. Ilara was submerged again, the slippery rope in her wrinkled fingers, pulling her into the icy depths of the pool. Water invaded her lungs with unexpected violence, and she coughed, choking, the air thin and painful. Her blurred vision, distorted by the water, showed only blurs of light and the imposing silhouette of the tiger, which was now almost completely out of the pool. Panic was a cold wave, more intense than the water itself, threatening to engulf her completely. Her right shoulder throbbed with searing pain, now radiating through her neck and arm, and her left arm, which held the rope with desperate determination, seemed about to break. She had no strength to pull herself up. She was drowning, ironically, after having survived the fall. The irony was a bitter poison in her mouth, mixed with the taste of chlorine and despair. Above her, the tiger had fully emerged. Its claws, sharp as razors, scraped the marble with a deafening sound, and its massive body rose, majestic and terrifying, against the morning sky. It did not look at Ilara, who struggled in the water, a fragile and insignificant figure. Its blue eyes, once fixed on her, were now turned towards the balcony from which the rope came, a low, guttural growl vibrating in its chest. It was a sound of warning, of possession, directed at the intruders who dared to invade its newly claimed territory. The animal looked like a living statue of power and savagery, an unexpected guardian, or perhaps a patient judge. The megaphone voice sounded again, closer, more urgent, cutting through the air like a blade. "Don't move, don't shoot. I repeat, do not shoot the animal." There was hesitation in the voice, a recognition of the impossible situation, poorly disguised panic. The men on the upper balcony, who had lowered the rope, seemed petrified. They were trying to pull Ilara, but the tiger was an insurmountable barrier, a threat that froze any movement. The rope, which had once seemed salvation, was now a tug-of-war between Ilara's exhaustion and the imposing presence of the beast. Ilara felt a tug on the rope, weak, hesitant. They were trying, but fear of the tiger prevented them from using full force. She needed to help, but her body refused to obey. Every muscle was agony, every breath a Herculean effort. The icy water drained the warmth from her bones, and the cold seeped into her mind, blurring her thoughts. The image of the killer, the shadow that had pushed her, returned with brutal clarity, sharper than the tiger itself. Was he watching? The police were arriving, the sirens now deafening, the sound filling the air with a deafening urgency. Time was running out for him too. That man would not let her escape. He would come to finish the job, or perhaps he was already sneaking away, blending into the crowd that would surely form. The idea that he could be a few feet away, watching her slow and painful end, was a chilling terror that surpassed even the fear of the tiger. The tiger, with a surprising movement, did not turn towards the men on the balcony. Instead, it turned to the pool, its blue eyes meeting Ilara's through the water. There was no aggression, but an intensity that made her hold her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. It snorted again, a sound that seemed almost a lament, and then, with unexpected agility for its size, it lowered itself, its front paws resting on the edge, its snout a few inches from the water, near where the rope was. It did not attack her. Instead, it did something unexpected. With a slow, deliberate movement, it nudged the rope with its snout, moving it slightly closer to Ilara, as if offering it. Or perhaps it was just playing, or exploring. The ambiguity was torturous, a macabre dance between hope and terror. What did it mean? Was it a sign, a whim of nature? Ilara, shocked by the tiger's action, felt a spark of hope, a faint flame amidst the despair. It was madness, but it seemed the animal was helping, or just curious. She couldn't afford to think. With a muffled cry, she used the tiger's impulse to propel herself, her fingers struggling to grasp the rope more firmly. She pulled with what remained of her strength, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder, which now radiated like fire throughout her right side. A stronger pull came from above, and she felt her body begin to move, slowly, out of the water. The tiger watched, motionless, as Ilara was pulled up. Her body was half out of the water, half in, slipping and scraping on the marble. Every inch was a battle, a tiny victory against gravity and exhaustion. Her right shoulder seemed to be on fire, and she felt blood trickling, mixing with the pool water, tinging it a faint red. She was almost there. The faces of the men on the upper balcony, previously terrified, now showed a mixture of relief and dread. They were focused on her, but their eyes darted to the tiger, which remained there, a white sphinx, observing the rescue with an almost human curiosity. The sirens were now directly below, and Ilara could hear the murmur of voices, the sound of boots running, the crackle of walkie-talkies. Help was there, palpable, but the danger had not yet passed. The tiger, with a final snort, turned its head to the balcony, its blue eyes narrowed as if assessing the new threat, the new intrusion into its aquatic sanctuary. Ilara, with a groan of exhaustion, was finally pulled out of the water, her body limp and trembling, falling heavily onto the balcony floor. She was saved from the pool, but not from danger. The tiger was a few feet away, and the killer, somewhere, still lurked. She could barely breathe, her body trembling uncontrollably, cold and pain dominating her. But she was alive, for now. The cold marble beneath her body was a relief, but the feeling of vulnerability persisted. She opened her eyes, trying to focus. The tiger was there, majestic, watching her, and beyond it, the invisible threat, the shadow of the killer, still loomed. The battle for her life was far from over. The cold marble beneath Ilara's body was a shock, a hard surface that seemed to suck the last remnant of warmth from her bones. She was out of the water, but the sensation of drowning persisted, no longer in her lungs, but in her mind, a dense fog of exhaustion and panic. Every fiber of her being trembled, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline still pumping through her veins, a poison that kept her on the verge of collapse. Her right shoulder throbbed with excruciating pain, a fire spreading through her arm and neck, and she could feel blood trickling, warm and sticky, mixing with the pool water that still drenched her clothes. The faces of the men who pulled her up were blurs of relief and horror. They had saved her from the water, but the danger was still there, imposing a few feet away. The albino tiger, a surreal vision of beauty and ferocity, remained on the edge of the pool, its blue eyes fixed on them, a white sphinx guarding a secret. There was no aggression in its gaze, but an intense, almost defiant curiosity that froze any sudden movement. The men, uniformed but unarmed, were paralyzed, torn between the urgency of attending to Ilara and the visceral fear of the beast. The megaphone voice, now muffled by proximity, echoed again, laden with new urgency. Animal containment team en route. I repeat, do not shoot. Maintain distance from the animal. The order was clear, but the situation chaotic. Ilara, lying on her side, tried to move, but her body refused to obey. She needed to speak, needed to warn about the killer, but the words dissolved into an inaudible moan. The sirens, previously distant, were now a deafening chorus, climbing through the floors, filling the air with the promise of help and the threat of more chaos. The murmur of voices intensified, the sound of boots running and radios crackling, indicating that police and other rescue teams were converging on the scene. The balcony, once an improbable refuge, was about to become a stage of confrontation. The tiger, with a slow and majestic movement, turned its head towards the balcony entrance. Its blue eyes narrowed. It did not growl, but the tension in its body was palpable, muscles taut under its white fur. It was assessing the new threat, the new intrusion into its territory. It was a wild, unpredictable animal, and the arrival of so many armed humans could trigger any reaction. Ilara, gasping, felt a gentle but firm tug. The men were trying to move her away from the tiger, carefully dragging her across the cold marble. Every movement was agony, but she clung to consciousness, fighting against the darkness that threatened to engulf her. She needed to stay awake. The killer, he was still there. The image of the shadow that had pushed her, the indistinct face, but the murderous intent was more real than the tiger itself. He would not let her escape. He would come to finish the job, or perhaps he was already sneaking away, blending into the crowd that was surely forming downstairs. The idea that he could be a few feet away, watching her slow and painful end, was a chilling terror that surpassed even the fear of the tiger. Suddenly, a shout, not from Ilara, but from one of the men. "He's moving!" The tiger, impatient with the invasion, took a step back, moving away from the pool. Its eyes swept the balcony, fixing on the men approaching the entrance, uniformed and carrying weapons. There was no hesitation in its gait, but a silent determination. It was not fleeing, but positioning itself, marking its space. One of the men, a paramedic with a pale face, finally managed to kneel beside Ilara. "Madam, are you all right? Can you hear me?" His voice was urgent, professional, but his eyes kept darting to the tiger. Ilara tried to nod, but only a groan escaped her cracked lips. She pointed a trembling finger upwards, to the floor from which she had fallen. Killer. The word was an almost inaudible whisper, but the paramedic seemed to understand the urgency in her eyes. Killer? Upstairs? He looked at his colleagues, who were already communicating via radio. The information spread like wildfire. The priority was shifting. It was not just a rescue, but a crime scene. The tiger, with a powerful snort that made the air vibrate, took another step back, its blue eyes fixed on the balcony door. from where more police officers and animal containment team members began to emerge. They were armed with tranquilizer darts, nets, and shields, but the animal's imposing presence was undeniable. The balcony became a silent battlefield, with the tiger at the center, a force of nature against human order. Ilara, semi-conscious, felt the paramedic's skilled hands assessing her shoulder, the pain increasing with the touch. She was covered with a thermal blanket, but the cold in her soul persisted. The killer. He could not escape. He was there, somewhere, a lurking shadow. The life she had fought so hard to maintain was still in danger. The battle for her life was far from over. She could feel the tiger's gaze upon her, almost a silent farewell, before the men with the darts began to approach, cautiously, forming a semicircle around the majestic beast. The tension was unbearable, a stretched thread about to snap. Ilara, lying on her side, tried to move, but her body refused to obey. She needed to speak, needed to warn about the killer, but the words dissolved into an inaudible moan. The sirens, previously distant, were now a deafening chorus, climbing through the floors, filling the air with the promise of help and the threat of more chaos. The murmur of voices intensified, the sound of boots running and radios crackling, indicating that police and other rescue teams were converging on the scene. The balcony, once an improbable refuge, was about to become a stage of confrontation. The image of the shadow that had pushed her, the indistinct face, but the murderous intent, was more real than the tiger itself. He would not let her escape. He would come to finish the job, or perhaps he was already sneaking away, blending into the crowd that was surely forming downstairs. The idea that he could be a few feet away, watching her slow and painful end, was a chilling terror that surpassed even the fear of the tiger. Suddenly, a shout, not from Ilara, but from one of the men. "He's moving!" The tiger, impatient with the invasion, took a step back, moving away from the pool. Its eyes swept the balcony, fixing on the men approaching the entrance, uniformed and carrying weapons. There was no hesitation in its gait, but a silent determination. It was not fleeing, but positioning itself, marking its space. One of the men, a paramedic with a pale face, finally managed to kneel beside Ilara. "Madam, are you all right? Can you hear me?" His voice was urgent, professional, but his eyes kept darting to the tiger. Ilara tried to nod, but only a groan escaped her cracked lips. She pointed a trembling finger upwards to the floor from which she had fallen. Killer. The word was an almost inaudible whisper, but the paramedic seemed to understand the urgency in her eyes. Killer. Upstairs, he looked at his colleagues, who were already communicating via radio. The information spread like wildfire. The priority was shifting. It was not just a rescue, but a crime scene. Suddenly, a sharp movement at the balcony entrance. Not from the tiger, but from one of the police officers who pointed to the floor above. "We found something, a forced door in the apartment she fell from." The voice, amplified by the radio, cut through the air, diverting the attention of some of those present. The paramedic, however, remained focused on Ilara, his eyes fixed on hers. "Madam, who is he? Do you know him?" Ilara tried to speak again, but pain and exhaustion overwhelmed her. Her vision darkened for an instant. The sound of the tiger snorting and the radio's crackling blending into a distant hum. She struggled to keep her eyes open, to convey the urgency of her message. The killer. He could not escape. As the animal containment team, now more numerous and determined, tightened the cordon around the tiger, tranquilizer darts ready to be fired, Ilara felt a stronger pull. They were moving her to a gurney, preparing her for evacuation. The world spun, but she could still see the tiger, an imposing and solitary figure, its blue eyes reflecting the flashing lights of the sirens that now invaded the balcony. It was the last thing she saw before a wave of darkness engulfed her, taking her to a place where pain and fear were only distant echoes. But even in unconsciousness, the shadow of the killer persisted, a promise that the fight had not yet ended. Darkness swallowed Ilara, but the chaos around her did not diminish. On the contrary, it intensified, transforming the balcony into a whirlwind of flashing lights, urgent voices, and the metallic sound of equipment. The gurney rolled, carrying her away from the epicenter of the confusion. But the image of the tiger, its blue eyes reflecting the night, remained etched in her mind, a last beacon before the abyss of unconsciousness. As Ilara was stabilized and prepared for emergency transport, the battle on the balcony reached its climax. The albino tiger, a mountain of muscle and immaculate fur, growled, a guttural sound that made the animal containment team's shields vibrate. It did not attack, but its posture was one of defiance, of a king cornered in its own domain. The tranquilizer darts, loaded and ready, were the only language the men could use. One of the specialists, a robust man with scars on his face, gave the order. "Now! 3 at once!" 3 shots echoed almost simultaneously, the darts whizzing through the air. 2 hit the tiger's flank. The third embedded itself in its hind leg. The animal roared, a sound of pain and fury that made the marble tremble. It staggered, its head spinning in search of a target, but the tranquilizer's effect was swift. Its movements became slow, uncoordinated. The majestic body began to give way, its legs faltering. With a last heavy snort, it collapsed, not with a thud, but with the resigned slowness of a giant tree falling, its white fur spreading over the cold marble. The tension dissipated in a collective sigh of relief, but the silence that followed was heavy, laden with the grandeur of the sleeping creature. Meanwhile, upstairs, the investigation team was already in action. The door to Ilara's apartment, violently forced open, revealed a scene of struggle. Overturned furniture, a broken vase on the floor, shards of glass scattered. It was evident that Ilara had not fallen by accident. The chief detective, a man with a tired face and keen eyes, inspected the scene with a forensic team. "It looks like there was a struggle here. Look for anything, fingerprints, fibers, anything that doesn't belong to her." One of the police officers, with a radio in hand, approached. "Chief, the victim is being taken to the hospital. She managed to whisper 'killer' and pointed upwards before losing consciousness." The detective nodded, his lips tight. "That confirms what we're seeing. Someone tried to kill her, and that person is no longer here." He scanned the apartment, looking for signs of a hasty escape. The window was open, but there was no balcony to jump from. The service door was intact. The only obvious exit was the main door, where the struggle seemed to have occurred. "Check the building's security cameras, all of them," the detective ordered. "Entrances, exits, elevators. We want to see who entered and exited in the last few hours, and who was on this floor." The urgency was palpable, a killer on the loose. Perhaps still within the luxurious condominium, blending in with the curious or the residents. Downstairs, on the pool balcony, Ilara was carefully carried to the ambulance. The paramedic who initially attended to her was by her side, monitoring her vital signs. Weak pulse, but stable. The fall was cushioned, but her shoulder is dislocated and there are signs of fractured ribs. And hypothermia is a risk. His voice was a professional murmur, but the tremor in his hands revealed the gravity of the situation. The scene was surreal. On one side, the albino tiger, now an inert mass, being prepared for transport by a veterinary team, its wild beauty contrasting with the artificiality of the environment. On the other, the ambulance with its rotating lights, ready to take Ilara to the most important battle of her life. The story of the tiger that leaped to save a life was already beginning to spread, whispered among the curious and the journalists who were starting to gather downstairs, attracted by the sirens and the commotion. But for those involved, the priority was different. The chief detective, still in Ilara's apartment, received new information over the radio. "Chief, the elevator cameras recorded a man leaving Ilara's floor a few minutes before the incident. He was wearing a cap and sunglasses and seemed to be in a hurry." The detective felt a chill. "Describe him and check all exits. Lock down the building if necessary. We can't let him escape." The hunt had begun. The tiger had played its part, an improbable guardian in a moment of despair. Now it was up to humans to unravel the mystery and bring justice. Ilara, unconscious, lay between life and death, a silent testament to inexplicable cruelty and an unprecedented miracle. The shadow of the killer loomed, and the entire city, unknowingly, was about to be dragged into the center of an enigma involving luxury, betrayal, and the purest form of survival instinct. The night was far from over, and the danger far from contained. The detective's order echoed through the radios, transforming the luxurious condominium into a trap. "Lock down the building! No one in, no one out!" The revolving doors of the main entrance clicked shut with a metallic sound. The garages were sealed, and the elevators, once symbols of ascent, became steel boxes under surveillance. The murmur of curious residents who had begun to gather in the lobbies turned into whispers of apprehension. The hunt had begun, and the prey, a killer on the loose, was cornered. Somewhere within that fortress of glass and concrete, the man in the cap and sunglasses felt the net closing in. He had descended via the service stairs, a route he deemed safe, blending in with the few employees still circulating on the lower floors. But now, the sound of sirens outside, which had seemed distant, invaded every corridor, every crack. The voices, amplified by internal security radios, which had been just a hum, now carried the urgency of an imminent search. He was trapped. His heart beat a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drum of panic he struggled to silence. The plan, so meticulously orchestrated, was crumbling. Ilara should be dead, her body splattered on the ground, a tragic accident, a fatal fall. But the old witch, old Ilara, always with inexplicable luck, had survived. And worse, she had whispered the word killer. He could feel cold sweat trickling down his neck, the cap tightening on his head. The sunglasses, once a disguise, now a mask that seemed to scream his guilt. He hid in a small cleaning supply closet in the basement, the smell of disinfectant and floor wax mingling with the metallic odor of his own fear. From one of the security guard's radios left on a cart, he heard the description: "Man, cap, sunglasses, left the victim's floor minutes before the incident." It was him. They knew. With each passing minute, the net tightened. Outside, the ambulance, its rotating lights cutting through the darkness of the night, sped through the city streets. Inside, Ilara lay pale and fragile, a thin thread connecting her to life. The paramedic, with a look of concern etched on his face, monitored every beat, every breath. "She's losing temperature. We need to get there fast." His voice was an urgent whisper, muffled by the sound of the siren. The tiger's miracle had given her a second chance, but her body, battered by the fall and the impact, was fighting its own battle. Her dislocated shoulder, fractured ribs, concussion. Every injury was a reminder of the brutality of the attack. As Ilara was rushed to the emergency room, the story of the albino tiger, an improbable guardian, was already spreading like a digital virus. Social media exploded with amateur videos and shaky photos of the majestic animal being tranquilized. Journalists, like vultures, were already gathering at the condominium entrance, their microphones extended, their cameras flashing, hungry for details. The pool balcony, once a stage of horror, was now a scene of morbid curiosity. With the tiger, now asleep, being carefully hoisted into a veterinary transport vehicle, its wild beauty contrasting with the artificiality of the surrounding luxury. In Ilara's apartment, the forensic team worked tirelessly, every fiber, every fingerprint, every shard of glass, a piece of the puzzle. The chief detective, with his grave expression, analyzed the scene, the image of the man in the elevator repeating in his mind. He knew the killer was nearby, breathing the same air, perhaps observing from afar. The urgency of finding him before he could disappear forever was a weight on his shoulders. Back in the closet, the man in the cap heard approaching footsteps. The voices of the police, now clearer, came from the corridor. Check every closet, every corner. He can't have evaporated. Panic turned to despair. He looked around, searching for an exit, a crack, anything. His eyes fell on a small grated window, high on the wall, leading to a service alley. It was too small, but adrenaline pumped through his veins, whispering promises of escape. He needed to act, and fast. Time was running out. The night, which should have been the stage for his silent triumph, had turned into his prison. The shadow of the killer, previously lurking, was now cornered, and the hunt was about to have a final confrontation. The entire city, unknowingly, held its breath, waiting for the outcome of a drama that began with a fall and a miracle. The night, which should have been the stage for his silent triumph, had turned into his prison. The shadow of the killer, previously lurking, was now cornered, and the hunt was about to have a final confrontation. The entire city, unknowingly, held its breath, waiting for the outcome of a drama that began with a fall and a miracle. In the cleaning supply closet, the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and the cold sweat of fear. The man in the cap and sunglasses, huddled among buckets and mops, heard approaching footsteps, each echo in the corridor a hammer striking his temple. The amplified voices from the security radios, previously distant, were now clear, almost beside him. Check every closet, every corner. He can't have evaporated. Panic, previously a whisper, was now a deafening scream in his mind. His desperate eyes swept the small space, searching for a crack, a breach in the trap that was closing. The small, grated window high on the wall, which led to a service alley, was his only hope. It seemed too small, impassable, but adrenaline pumped through his veins, whispering promises of escape, of a last chance. He needed to act, and fast. With a grunt of effort, he dragged a heavy cleaning cart, piling it with buckets and empty boxes. The makeshift tower swayed precariously, but he had no time for subtleties. He climbed, muscles tense, fingers scraping the damp, cold wall. The iron grate, rusty and stubborn, seemed to seal his fate, an insurmountable barrier between him and freedom. He pulled, pushed, the skin on his hands tearing against the rough metal, the pain a mere background noise to the urgency that consumed him. The footsteps outside grew louder, the voices clearer. "Are you sure you checked everything here? Only this closet left." He could hear the click of the doorknob. There was no more time. With a muffled cry of fury and despair, he gave a final push to the grate, feeling the rust give way with a sharp metallic creak that seemed to tear the silence. The grate came loose on one side, hanging precariously, opening a minimal gap. It was enough. He squeezed his body through, feeling his skin tear against the rough metal, the pain excruciating, but adrenaline propelled him. Every inch was a victory, every scratch a mark of his determination. With a final effort, he broke free, falling into the dark alley, a dull thud that seemed to echo in the night, muffled by the distant sound of sirens. He was free, but at a cost. His shoulder ached, his leg throbbed, but he was out. In the corridor, the chief detective and his team approached the closet. The radio in his hand crackled with updates. "No exit found, Chief. He's here." The detective nodded, his gaze fixed on the door. He can't have vanished into thin air. He opened the closet door, his flashlight sweeping the small space. The strong smell of cleaning products, the overturned cleaning cart, the stacked buckets, and the window. The iron grate, now bent, one side loose, swaying slightly in the night breeze. "He escaped," the detective murmured, his voice heavy with frustration and a hint of respect for the criminal's audacity. Through the service alley, teams outside, now, block the alley. He can't have gone far, not like this. The order echoed through the radios, and the hunt extended to the dark, winding streets surrounding the condominium. Meanwhile, the ambulance braked sharply at the hospital emergency entrance. The doors opened, revealing Ilara's pale and fragile figure. A medical team was already waiting, gurneys and equipment ready. Fall victim, severe hypothermia, multiple fractures, concussion. The paramedics shouted the information as they wheeled her inside, her fragile body a blur of vulnerability amidst the commotion. Every second was crucial. Her life, saved by the tiger's miracle, still hung by a thin thread. Outside, chaos reigned. Reporters jostled, cameras flashed, microphones were thrust at anyone who seemed to have information. The story of the saving tiger was the headline, but the search for a killer inside a luxury condominium added a layer of suspense that the media could not ignore. Ilara's name, once synonymous with discretion and wealth, was now splashed across all news channels, linked to a drama that mixed savagery and human cruelty. In the dark alley, the man in the cap staggered, each step an agony. But freedom was a more potent engine than pain. He would blend into the shadows, disappear into the vastness of the city. He had failed to kill Ilara, but he had escaped. For now, the hunt was far from over, and the night, which seemed endless, still held more twists. The city, now fully awake, awaited the next chapter of this improbable drama. The dull thud of the fall in the dark alley was a prelude to the chaos that would follow. The man in the cap, now without the sunglasses that had been lost in his desperate escape, staggered, the excruciating pain in his shoulder and leg throbbing at a frantic pace. The icy night air whipped his face, mingling with the cold sweat that trickled down his forehead. He was free, yes, but freedom was a fragile illusion, a mirage amidst the darkness and the increasingly close sound of sirens. The alley, narrow and filthy, was a labyrinth of overflowing dumpsters and stacked boxes, a brutal contrast to the opulent luxury of the condominium he had just left. He dragged himself, using the damp walls for support, each step a battle against pain and panic. The instinct for survival, primitive and powerful, was the only thing propelling him. He needed to disappear, to dissolve into the vastness of the city before the net closed completely. Outside, the voice of the chief detective echoed through the security radios, cutting through the night with relentless urgency. "Block the alley. He can't have gone far." The order spread like wildfire, and within seconds, the blue and red lights of patrol cars began to flash at the ends of the alley, sealing his only escape route. The sound of boots running on the wet asphalt approached, and the killer felt the cordon tighten even further. His eyes, wide with terror, swept the alley, searching for an exit, a crack, anything. A rusty iron gate, which seemed to lead to an inner courtyard of some neighboring building, caught his attention. It was his only chance. With a final gasp of determination, he threw himself against the gate, forcing the flimsy lock with a desperate shove. The metal groaned but gave way, opening a path to darkness. He slipped inside, closing the gate behind him, his heart pounding like a war drum. On the other side, the police officers stormed the alley, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, revealing the trail of overturned boxes and the half-open gate. "He's in here! Inside!" The detective's voice was thunder, and the pursuit intensified, turning into a frantic hunt through the courtyards and back alleys surrounding the condominium. Meanwhile, at the epicenter of the hospital emergency, Ilara was a pale and fragile figure, wrapped in white sheets, her body a canvas of vulnerability. Doctors and nurses moved with choreographed precision, each action a step in the delicate dance between life and death. Monitors beeped at a constant rhythm, each sound a note in the symphony of the struggle for survival. Blood pressure unstable, severe hypothermia, We need to stabilize her body temperature immediately." The chief doctor's voice was calm, but carried a gravity that did not go unnoticed. "The fractures are multiple, but the greatest risk now is concussion and internal bleeding. Prepare for surgery." The tiger's miracle had given her a second chance, but the fall from the 12th floor had exacted a heavy toll. Ilara's body, once vibrant and full of life, was now on the verge of collapse. The image of the albino tiger, majestic and wild, which had plunged into the pool at the exact moment, was a vivid reminder of the improbability of her survival. But luck, or fate, had intervened, and now it was medicine's turn to fight for her. Outside, the city buzzed with the news. Social media exploded with the story of the savior tiger and the killer on the run. News channels broadcast live from the hospital entrance and the condominium, their reporters competing for every detail, every angle of the story. Ilara's image, once a discreet figure of high society, was now an icon of resilience. Her life a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the unpredictability of fate. In the dark courtyard, the man in the cap dragged himself, the burning sensation in his shoulder and leg intensifying with each movement. He could hear the barking of police dogs, now added to the chorus of sirens and voices. The hunt had become personal, and he was the prey. He spotted a high fence, which seemed to lead to a busy street. It was his only hope. With superhuman effort, he began to climb, his bloodied fingers gripping the barbed wire, the pain a silent scream in his throat. He knew he couldn't stop. If caught, everything would be lost. Revenge, the meticulous plan, the life he had built on secrets and lies, everything would crumble. He needed to escape, disappear, and plan his next move. The city, with its dazzling lights and deep shadows, was his only ally. With a final pull, he threw himself over the other side of the fence, landing heavily on the sidewalk of a busy street. Cars whizzed past, their lights blinding him for an instant. He stood up staggering and blended into the crowd of pedestrians, an anonymous figure in the vastness of the night. The hunt continued, but now the killer was back in the concrete jungle, a ghost among the lights, determined not to be found. The night, which seemed endless, still held secrets and twists, and the entire city unknowingly held its breath, waiting for the outcome of a drama that began with a fall and a miracle, and now transformed into a desperate race for survival. He blended into the crowd, a pale and wounded spectre in the incessant dance of the city's nightlife. Each step was a stab in his shoulder and leg, but adrenaline and dread were more potent painkillers than any medicine. The smell of exhaust fumes and street food replaced the mustiness of the alley, and the anonymous voices around him were a welcome shield against the chorus of sirens that still echoed in the distance. He spotted a bus stopping at a point ahead, its doors hissing like an invitation. Without hesitation, he dragged himself inside, tossing a crumpled bill to the driver, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of pursuit. The bus departed, swallowing him in the darkness and blurred lights of the metropolis. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Ilara's surgery entered its most critical moment. The medical team worked under a tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeps of monitors and the chief surgeon's precise orders. Intracranial pressure rising. We need to act now. The voice, previously calm, now carried a palpable urgency. The concussion, initially a concern, had become the most imminent threat. Ilara's brain, traumatized by the fall, was swelling, and every millimeter of extra pressure was a step closer to the point of no return. The life the tiger had saved with an improbable leap now hung by an even thinner thread, inside a cold, sterile room where science and hope waged a battle against time. Outside, the chief detective, with a team of police officers and sniffer dogs, scoured the courtyard and the fence, frustration evident on his face. He's no amateur. He knew what he was doing. He observed the bloodstains on the barbed wire, a painful trail, but one that was lost in the vastness of the busy street. Area security cameras. Anything that saw an injured man getting on a bus or taxi. He can't have vanished into thin air. The hunt had shifted phase, from a tight cordon to a search for a needle in a haystack. But the detective's determination was unwavering. He knew the man in the cap was dangerous, and that as long as he was at large, the entire city was at risk. The story of Ilara and the tiger was just the beginning of a much larger drama, and the detective felt he was about to unravel a web of secrets that extended far beyond the walls of the luxury condominium. The night wore on, but for the killer on the run, for the woman fighting for her life, and for the lawmen in their relentless pursuit, it was only just beginning to reveal its true horrors. The bus, a monster of metal and flickering lights, swallowed the man in the cap, dragging him away from the epicenter of chaos. He squeezed into a seat at the back, the darkness offering a welcome veil to his injured figure. Every jolt of the vehicle was agony for his shoulder and leg, but he forced himself to ignore the pain, to focus only on escape. The faces around him were a blur of indifference, each passenger immersed in their own nocturnal world. No one seemed to notice the cold sweat on his forehead, the uncontrollable tremor in his hands, or the dried blood staining his shirt sleeve. He was just another shadow in the city that never slept, a ghost in transit. His eyes, now without the sunglasses, scanned the passing streets, searching for a disembarkation point that offered anonymity and a chance to regroup. The neon lights of bars and restaurants gave way to more modest facades, to old buildings and less illuminated streets. It was what he needed. A neighborhood where surveillance was less intense, where an injured stranger would not attract so much attention. Spotting a dark alley between two closed shops, he pulled the cord, signaling his stop. With a last glance back, he stepped off the bus, blending once again into the darkness, the distant sound of sirens, still a constant reminder of the hunt on his heels. He dragged himself for a few more blocks, each step a battle against exhaustion and pain. Finally, he found a roadside motel with a neon sign flashing vacancy in faded letters. It was perfect, a place where questions weren't asked, where discretion was the most valuable currency. With what little money he had left, he rented the cheapest room, paying in cash, leaving no digital traces. Once inside, the door locked, he collapsed onto the bed, his body protesting in every muscle and bone. Adrenaline began to subside, and the pain, previously a distant hum, now screamed in his ears. He needed a plan, and fast. The albino tiger, the miracle that had thwarted his plan, was now an image etched in his mind, a vivid reminder that fate at times had its own cruel designs. But he was not a man to give up. Revenge was still his sole purpose, and Ilara, even on the verge of death, was still his target. Meanwhile, at the epicenter of the medical emergency, the operating room was a battleground against death. Monitors beeped at a frantic pace, each sound an alarm for the medical team fighting to save Ilara. Intracranial pressure is dangerously rising. We need to relieve the pressure now. Dr. Almeida's voice, the chief surgeon, cut through the tense air, his grave expression beneath the surgical mask. His hands, once firm and precise, now moved with even greater urgency. The concussion, the brain trauma caused by the fall, was the most insidious threat, a ticking time bomb inside Ilara's head. A nurse passed an instrument, and the metallic sound echoed in the tense silence. Dr. Almeida made a precise incision, the tension in the room palpable. Every second was crucial, every movement a delicate dance between life and death. Ilara's body, once so strong, was now a canvas of fragility, her life hanging by a thread so thin it could barely be seen. The team worked in sync, an orchestra of skills and knowledge, each member focused on a single goal: to stabilize the patient. Slowly, painfully, The numbers on the monitors began to yield, the intracranial pressure decreasing, a collective sigh of relief filling the room. The surgery was still far from over, but the worst for now had been averted. Ilara had survived yet another obstacle, a testament to the strength of her spirit and the miraculous intervention that brought her there. The path to recovery would be long and uncertain, but hope, for a brief moment, shone brighter. Outside, the city buzzed, but the chief detective, in his makeshift command center, felt the weight of the night. No clear image from the bus. The cameras on that route are old and low resolution. The voice of one of his agents was laden with frustration. The detective slammed his fist on the table. He can't have evaporated. He's injured. He needs help, or at least a place to hide. Expand the search radius to all cheap motels, boarding houses, any place that accepts cash and asks no questions. Check pharmacies and smaller hospitals, clandestine clinics. He might try to treat his injuries. The hunt had transformed into a race against time and against the cunning of an invisible enemy. The detective knew the man in the cap was not just an ordinary criminal. He was a ghost, someone who had learned to disappear. He's a professional, a lone wolf. He won't leave an easy trail, but every wolf needs a den. The mention of the albino tiger on television, which was now the star of all news reports, brought a brief diversion of thought. The animal, a majestic male named Kale, was being transferred to a sanctuary, his heroic actions celebrated worldwide. It was a strange reminder of how chance could change destiny. But for the detective, the focus was on the man who had tried to defy that destiny. He felt that the story of Ilara and the tiger was just the tip of the iceberg, and that behind the attack lay a much more complex plot, a web of secrets that stretched back years. The night, which seemed endless, still held its darkest secrets, and the entire city, unknowingly, held its breath, waiting for the outcome of a drama that began with a fall and a miracle, and now transformed into a desperate race for survival and truth. In the stuffy motel room, the man in the cap, now without it, was a pathetic but dangerous figure. The pain in his shoulder and leg pulsed with cruel rhythm, but rage was a fire that burned stronger. He cleaned his wounds with torn towels and cold water, each touch an agony he received as penance and fuel. The albino tiger Kale was a shadow in his mind, a vivid reminder of fate's irony. But fate, he thought, could be defied. Ilara still lived, and as long as she breathed, his mission would not be complete. He needed a plan, one that didn't rely on luck or an animal's failure. The hospital would be a challenge, a labyrinth of security and surveillance, but he knew labyrinths. He knew the art of disguise, of invisibility in plain sight. His eyes swept the room, stopping on a janitor's uniform hanging on the door of a half-open closet in the corridor. A dangerous but possible idea began to form. He needed more than just discretion, he needed access. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the quiet of Ilara's recovery room was deceptive. The soft beeps of the monitors were the only melody, a hymn to the life that clung on. Dr. Almeida, exhausted, but with a glimmer of victory in her eyes, observed the charts. Intracranial pressure had stabilized. The surgery had been a technical success, but Ilara was still in an induced coma, her body and mind in a state of forced rest, a shield against trauma. Recovery would be a marathon, not a sprint, and uncertainty hung like a fog. Outside, the city began to lighten, but the chief detective's night of work was far from over. The call from the manager of a roadside motel, one of many on the expanded list, was the needle in the haystack he had hoped for. An injured man, paid in cash, looked pale and nervous, didn't want to be seen. The description was vague, but the detective's instinct screamed it was him. Send a team to the motel now, surround the place, but don't go in yet. He's dangerous. Adrenaline surged back into his veins. He knew the man in the cap wouldn't give up. His target was still Ilara. Increase security at the hospital. No one enters or leaves without strict identification. Reinforce the guard at Ilara's room. He'll try again. The SWAT team arrived at the motel in minutes, moving with the precision of predators. The cordon was set, but the room was empty. The back window, forced. A bloodied towel, a crumpled note on the table. He was gone. The chief detective punched the wall. He knew we were coming. He's one step ahead. But there was a trail, a torn note, left behind with a hospital address and a scribbled time. A distraction or a desperate plan? The detective felt a chill down his spine. He wasn't trying to escape. He was preparing for the final attack. At the hospital, the man in the cap, now dressed in a stolen janitor's uniform, pushed a cleaning cart, his figure bent and discreet. No one noticed him. Just another invisible worker in the institution's machinery. The pain in his shoulder and leg was a constant reminder, but the proximity of his target propelled him. He knew the room number, the floor. Revenge was within his grasp. He approached Ilara's room, his heart pounding. 2 police officers stood at the door, their faces tired but alert. He hesitated, but determination was greater than fear. He needed a distraction. At that very instant, the chief detective with a reinforcement team ran through the hospital corridors. Intuition, more than any concrete evidence, guided him. He felt that time was running out. Quick, to Ilara's room! The man in the cap with a sudden movement knocked over the cleaning cart, scattering buckets and chemicals across the floor. The noise and strong smell caught the attention of the police officers, who turned to see what had happened. It was enough. In a flash, he pulled out a knife he had hidden under his uniform and lunged towards the door. But before he could even touch the doorknob, a deep, authoritative voice echoed down the corridor. "Stop! Hands up!" The chief detective, gun drawn, was there, flanked by his men. The man in the cap froze, the knife still in his trembling hand. His eyes, full of hatred and frustration, met the detective's. He knew it was the end. Without a word, he dropped the knife, which fell with a metallic clink to the floor. The fight was over. The hunt finally had come to an end. Later, at the police station, the man in the cap, identified as Marco, a former business partner of Ilara's who had been ruined by a dubious transaction years ago, confessed his revenge plan. The web of secrets the detective suspected began to unravel, revealing a story of betrayal and desperation that culminated in the heinous act. Ilara, still in a coma, was safe. The road to recovery would be long, but the life that the tiger Kyle had saved and that the medical team had fought to preserve now had a real chance. Kyle, the improbable hero, was already on his way to his new sanctuary, his story of bravery echoing around the world. The city, which for days held its breath, could finally exhale. The drama that began with a fall and a miracle and transformed into a desperate race for survival and truth had reached its conclusion. But the memory of the elderly woman who fell from the sky and the tiger who defied fate to save her would remain, an eternal reminder that even in the darkest moments, life finds a way, and hope at times comes in the wildest and most unexpected forms.